In this lesson, we're going to be talking more about CSS and in particular CSS selectors. You've already seen HTML and CSS at work together. Now you'll learn how to actually construct CSS. So far, you've learned how to use HTML tags. And while HTML is critical to defining the structure of a page, most of the pages we've built with just plain HTML look pretty boring. That's where CSS comes in. CSS helps us make our web pages look pretty. It gives it style. So remember that every basic web page has three components. First is the content that you actually want to share with your audience. This might be text, images, video, audio, etc. Second is the structure of the page, and this is what you define using HTML markup. HTML gives your content structure and meaning. For example, it says this is a heading, or this is a paragraph, or this is a footer. And lastly, CSS is going to give it appearance. CSS is a presentation language that gives web content its style. Let's see how it works. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and in a later lesson, we'll learn why they're called cascading. Again, it gives web content style. CSS works hand in hand with HTML, but it's not actually HTML. If you look at the screen, you'll see some sample CSS rules. Take a look closely at the code. See if you can interpret some of what the styles here are. Every piece of CSS code is written as a rule. So the CSS rule has three basic parts. It's got a selector, a property, and a value. The selector is going to be the thing that you want to style. It's usually going to be an HTML element, ID, or a class. And then the property is a property that you'd like to style. And finally, the value is a value that you want that property to take on. So for example here, our selector is body. You're familiar with body. It's the HTML tag that defines the entire body of a web page. In this case, we have two properties, background color and color. Background color is the background color of the page, while color refers to the text color. And in this case, we're styling the background color in green and the color in dark olive green. When you write a CSS rule, you can write one rule or multiple rules in the same section, such as you see here. So again, the selector identifies the HTML elements that you want to style. And the way that we select these elements is either by type, class, or ID. Let's look at each of those separately. So, selecting selectors by type should be fairly familiar. We've learned about a few different types of HTML elements so far. For example, P, which stand for paragraph, but you also probably remember H1, which is the top level heading, or UL, which is an unordered list. Here we have two different CSS rules. The first rule selects all the paragraph elements, whereas the second rule selects all EM elements within a paragraph. Here, EM stands for emphasis, and it typically looks like something that you want italicized. So in this case, we're going to select only the EM elements within a paragraph. So you see here how we can chain the element types. The other way that we can identify CSS selectors are by IDs and classes. IDs and classes let us style things that aren't typical HTML elements. And IDs and classes are things that you, the developer, would define. So, for example, the first rule says, select the element on the page with the ID of footer. In this case, you, the developer, have chosen this ID, footer, and now you're selecting it. The second rule says, select all elements of the page on the page with class of warning. The main difference between IDs and classes is that an ID should only apply to one element on a web page. For example, a footer. Most web pages will only have one footer, whereas a class would apply to many elements of the page. For example, like a warning, you might have multiple warnings throughout the page. In CSS, IDs are represented with a pound sign or a hashtag, whereas classes are represented with a period, as in this example. Cool. So now you're going to practice writing some CSS rules. Here I have 5 examples for which you have to write the CSS rule. And here's an example that I've already done for you. Let's say you were asked to write a CSS rule that would give all the images on a page a solid border of 1 pixel. Here's how you do it. First, you'd write the selector, which is IMG, and then 2 brackets. And in between the bracket, you would include the property. In this case, the property is border, and then the values. In this case, we have 2 values. We want the border to be 1 pixel and solid. Now, take a look at the quiz and try writing these CSS rules on your own.